Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Universalist Unitarian Church of Halifax, live online from English Street and in various places across the province and the country today. My name is Norm Herofker, and I'm the proud minister of this congregation. Jessica Friesen is our music director, and Marie-Claude Leroux is our director of religious exploration, and John Piccolo is our volunteer technician. Today, the reflection will be presented by Ralph Martin, a longtime friend of the congregation, with musical contributions from his daughter, Mariah Martin Sheen. Okay, so we're still learning. We're still learning how to host a Sunday service online. And you know that if you were here in the sanctuary in person and someone we had not met yet came into the room, many of us would go over to that person, introduce ourselves, say hello, and do what we could to make them feel welcome and comfortable. During the service today, the chat function will be open, and I invite you to say hello there to anyone that you don't recognize. Let's extend our hospitality in new ways. Before the service begins, I have a few announcements. First, if you're not already receiving notifications of our church, from our church bulletin, and you'd like to receive updates on our activities and our services, please send an email to me, minister@uuch.ca, and we'll add you to our electronic mailing list. The order of service today was sent out over UU Info on Friday, and it contains more detail on the following items. Again, an recommendation to watch and follow UU Info. A notice about the CUC Coffee House, which is online next Saturday, May 30th at 7 p.m. An important notice about pipelines, democracy, and Aboriginal title. And there'll be more on that later in the service, but look there for that information. And a notice that the deadline for the newsletter is noon Tuesday, May the 26th. So now as we settle in, some gathering music requested by our guest speaker and presented by Jessica. Over to you, Jessica.
Hello, everyone. For the gathering music, we are going to be doing These Hands by Dave Gunning. So if you know it, follow along, sing along, and otherwise just sit back and relax. Some hands have held the world together. Some hands have fought in wars forever. Tell me, what shall I do with these hands of mine? Some hands have blessed a million people. Some hands have held free the world from evil. Tell me, what shall I do with these hands of mine? What shall I do with these hands of mine? What shall I do with these hands of mine? The world could use a hero of the humankind. So tell me, what shall I do with these hands of mine? Some hands can stop a life from dying. Some hands comfort a baby crying. So tell me, what shall I do with these hands of mine? Everyone sing, what shall I do with these hands of mine? What shall I do with these hands of mine? The world could use a hero of the humankind. So tell me, what shall I do with these hands of mine? Some hands give a voice to the nation. Some hands wrote the times they're changing. So tell me, what shall I do with these hands of mine? I want to hear you at home. Ready? What shall I do? What shall I do with these hands of mine? What shall I do with these hands of mine? The world could use a hero of the humankind. So tell me, what shall I do? Oh, with these hands of mine. One more time, ready? Let's see your hands. What shall I do with these hands of mine? What shall I do with these hands of mine? The world could use a hero of the humankind. So tell me, what shall I do with these hands of mine? Back to you, Norm.
Thank you, Jessica. That was very nice. And while you were playing, we were watching your hands making beautiful music. So it's one of the things you can do, and it's quite amazing. Thank you. In each service, we acknowledge that we're living on unceded Mi'kmaq land, the land of Mi'kma'ki. We acknowledge that a great injustice has been done to the indigenous peoples of Mi'kma'ki, and we struggle to find ways to reconcile those facts with our lives today. It's hard for me to do that every Sunday and not just feel like we're going through the motions and we're just making an acknowledgement, but what are we going to do about it? Well, this very day, we have an opportunity to take a step in that direction. Tonight at 8 p.m., you have the opportunity to join with other CUC members and friends for a conversation with Dr. Nigan Sinclair about how non-Indigenous people can be in solidarity with Indigenous nations when those nations appear to be divided. The session will explore issues in Aboriginal land, hereditary versus colonial leadership, consent, consultation, and the various layers of justice to be considered when addressing issues such as climate action. The session is intended for settlers who want to engage in relationship building and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and their communities. Dr. Nigan Sinclair is the son of Senator Murray Sinclair, who is the Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Nigan has been steeped in conversations related to reconciliation and comes from a wealth of lived experience with the complexities of implementing reconciliation on a political and on a grassroots level. So when you hear our acknowledgement of the wrongs done to Indigenous peoples and you ask, what can I do? Start building relationships. Start by learning more. There's a sliding ticket price for this event tonight, ranging from $10 to $25. Our congregation will pay for your ticket if the ticket price is an obstacle for you. If that is the case, again, please contact me, your minister, Norm Harofker. See the order of service for links that will lead you to the Eventbrite page where you can sign up for the event tonight. And now, over to Jessica for the prelude music for our session.
Hello, everyone. I've decided to play, pardon my French, La Fille aux Cheveux de Lin by Claude Debussy. This is one of my favorite pieces that he wrote, and the piece was actually named after a poem by Le Comte de Lis. It's known for its musical simplicity. So like I said, I just want you to sit back, relax, and take in this moment.
Thank you. In a moment, I'll be lighting the chalice here in the sanctuary on English Street. But first, these words. In the earth all around us today, determined seeds are germinating, nourished by the earth, warmed by the sun. Seeds determined to become all that they can be. And within our hearts this morning, determined seeds of our personal spiritual growth struggle to germinate. They too need nourishment, the nourishment of our supportive community, and the warmth of our love for one another and for all of creation. May this sacred flame remind us to tend the garden that is our heart so that the determined seeds there can become all that they can be. One of the advantages of holding our services online is the ability for everyone to meet UU ministers from across the country. This morning, I'm delighted to invite a dear colleague, Reverend Heather Fraser-Fawcett from Montreal. Heather is an ordained UU minister, working as a community minister. This means her ministry is not primarily as a pastor for a congregation. Heather has worked for the past 14 years as a psychotherapist and counselor, specializing in trauma work. Her clients suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma, combat stress and injuries, fears, phobias, anxieties, and depression. She works extensively with refugees arriving in Canada. Heather, welcome to this Sunday service of the Universalist Unitarian Church of Halifax. Over to you.
Thank you, Norm. Good morning, everyone. I am so very happy to be here with you. Before talking about my ministry, though, I just want to tell you that the people of Halifax and the people of Nova Scotia have been in my heart and in the hearts of so many, so many. We're with you. You've had some really tough times lately and a number of tragedies, and we hold you in our hearts. Now, I've long had a special connection to Halifax, and very briefly, it's through my paternal grandfather. He served as the paymaster on the Niobe, the headquarter ship during the First World War, and he, his wife, and two daughters were here in Halifax, during the Halifax explosion. Many years later, my father served in the Army during World War II and suffered great injuries. And he was a radio operator in tanks, and my mother was an Army nurse. I have a nephew who has served in Bosnia. And I think growing up, I had a sense of the trauma that people were still suffering from, people from First World War and the Second and later on. When I started exploring what I would really love to do in my ministry, I knew it was something that would be working with a marginalized community. And my internship, other than my in-congregation preaching, congregational ministry internship, I did two. And the second one was with Montreal City Mission, which is a social justice ministry of the United Church. And I was a pastoral animator there and worked with refugees for a year in that ministry. I then decided, having been introduced to an organization through my work, an organization called RIVO. It is now called RIVO Resilience. And this organization, a not-for-profit group, works with refugees, but a particular demographic of refugees. We work with refugees who have been tortured. So for the past 14 years, this has been my work. During that time, in the early days and just before starting with Revo, I began a doctorate in psychology. And I have worked with refugees now from all over the world. We know that torture is practiced in over 100 countries on a regular basis. Can you imagine? Over 100 countries. And although the numbers of refugees arriving in Canada who have suffered torture are many, we also know that it's really a drop in the bucket. I've worked with people from the Middle East, from Africa, from places like Rwanda, Bosnia, South America, Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean. And the work sometimes has been tough, but I've always felt it was a privilege to do this. This is my ministry, and I am told that I give people hope. Well, it works both ways, because I must say that I have been given hope working with these individuals and families. And so today I leave you by extending my hands and offering you that hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I'm hoping you can get a taste for what a privilege it is to be a Unitarian Universalist minister, and the wonderful colleagues that I meet, and the wonderful colleagues who are doing such incredible work in the world. I'd like now to introduce another special guest this morning, and our presenter this morning, Ralph Martin. Ralph is a retired professor of plant agriculture in the Ontario Agricultural College at the University of Guelph. He founded the Organic Agricultural Centre of Canada. From 2012 to 2016, he was the Loblaws Chair of Sustainable Food Production at the University of Guelph. He is currently chair of the Canadian Rights and Freedom Centre, and he was a candidate for the Green Party of Canada in the past federal election, has been a supporter of that party for many years. Ralph was a professor at the Nova Scotia Agricultural College of Dalhousie University in Truro from 1990 till 2011. And during that time, he attended our congregation here in Halifax. He was a professor at the University of Guelph from 2011 to 2019 and has been a member of the Unitarian congregation in Guelph since 2011. Ralph, by the way, is the author of a new book, Food Security from Excess to Enough. And that is available, I believe, at the Bookmark here in Halifax. There's also information about it and more on Ralph's website, www.ralphmartin.ca. And last but not least, as you'll see, he's a very proud father. Over to you, Ralph.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to display a photo here, and this photo is very important to me. I showed it to some children recently, and of course what they noticed first were the horses. And as far as I know, those horses are not Pete and Jill. This photo was taken before I was born, and the horses on the farm when I was around were Pete and Jill. I think this might be Queenie and King. There's a wagon there, and the young people that I was showing this to picked up on the fact that it was a wagon, but it's a very special kind of wagon. It's a wagon that's full of, well, yes, manure. And it's a manure spreader. And it's designed to distribute manure on the fields. This is taken in our home farm. That's the barn. And on the manure spreader, one of my favorite people is Grandpa. And Grandpa is there. He's just loaded the spreader, and he's heading out to the field to distribute it. Now, when I was about 5 or 6, my mother told me that the Queen was coming to Kitchener, and that's close to where Mariah lives now. And I said, oh. And then she said, well, let's go to Kitchener to see the Queen. And I said, and I said, what do you do when you see the Queen? And she said, well, the Queen sits in a car without a roof, and then you're on the sidewalk and you can look at her and see her, and when she goes by, you can wave at her. And I said, oh, well, if you don't want to do that, then you have to help your grandpa on the farm. And I said, oh, okay. And she said, and today he's hauling manure. And I said, great. So my decision was to not see the Queen and to help Grandpa haul manure. That to me was important work. I loved it. Grandpa had a special fork for me that had broken, and he had used sandpaper to smooth out the handle. And I think in the whole time that he was loading the load, I might have put about 10 forkfuls on, but I was helping and he was very proud of me. And we were taking this manure to the fields to make all the crops grow. And this is part of essential recycling in agriculture. So that's the story for today. Back to you, Norm.
Thank you, Ralph. I'm sure the Queen would have approved. This morning, we're delighted to have Ralph's daughter, Mariah Martin Sheen, to present music during our service this morning. Mariah attended our church here in Halifax from when she was a baby until she left for university. She studied computer science, neuroscience, and the performing arts. She's currently living in Waterloo, working at a tech startup and involved with a number of local theater companies. Mariah's opening song. Over to you, Mariah.
Thanks, Norm. I'm going to be singing the Garden Song, which is one of my favorite songs from when I was a child. I always liked to sing it and pretend that I was planting a garden. And then when I got older, I got to be able to plant my own gardens for real. So I'm going to share this song. Inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow. All I need is a rake and a hoe and a piece of fertile ground. Inch by inch, row by row, someone bless these seeds I sow. Someone keep them warm below till the rains come tumbling down. Pulling weeds, picking stones, we are made of dreams and bones. Need a place to call my own, for the time is near at hand. Grain for grain, sun and rain, find my way through nature's chain. Tune my body and my brain to the music of the land. Inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow. Gonna mulch it deep and low, gonna make it fertile ground. Inch by inch, row by row, please bless these seeds I sow. Please keep them warm below till the rains come tumbling down. Back to you, Norm.
Thank you, Mariah. And if I didn't mention, Mariah is live with us from Waterloo, Ontario. And I cannot let it go by without noticing that she's a beautiful ukulele player and go Unitarian Universalist ukuleles. So now's the time in our service that we speak of joys and sorrows. It's a special time to reflect on our joys and sorrows. It's a sacred time in our service. It's a time that we set apart to honor the many sorrows and the many joys that you, the congregation, are living, and to acknowledge the mutual support of our community. Each week, I invite anyone with a joy or a sorrow to share at this time to relay their thoughts to me by email. Again, this morning and every morning until this plague passes, I want to light a candle for the members of our congregation that are in the Northwood Center. John Patterson and Marie Davis, George Marenfeld, and Irisha Cox are all members of our congregation, all living at Northwood and all doing okay, despite the serious outbreak of COVID-19. for the residents at Northwood. This week has been a very trying time for Tanya Billsbury, Ivy Rose, and Brad. First, Ivy Rose was rushed to hospital where she was kept for 2 days, and she's apparently developed diabetes. But she's home now and doing well. And then with Ivy just home and recovered, Brad briefly fell ill as well. Thankfully, he's doing fine now. I want to light 3 candles because I know how stressful it's been for the family. One for Ivy Rose, one for Brad, and one for Tanya. On a more positive note, I got an email asking that we light a candle this morning in celebration of the return of nesting birds. For those of you who have been able to spot a bird's nest and watch the cycle of life begin again, it is always miraculous. Later, when we stop live streaming on YouTube and before the coffee hour begins, I'll invite anyone else to share a joy or sorrow if they would like to do so. Now, Mariah again will lead us in our reflective hymn. Take it away, Mariah.
Okay. So I'm going to play a hymn that I think a lot of people will know. It was one of my Papa and my favorites from the UU Church, Spirit of Life. Spirit of life, come unto me, sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion, flow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me. Back to you, Norm.
Thank you, Mariah. May the joys and sorrows, both those acknowledged here this morning and those held in the silent sanctuary of our hearts, weave us together in the interdependent fabric of our community. And now I get to turn the service back to our special guest, Professor Ralph Martin.
Thank you. I want to read from my book, and this is one of the paragraphs that I really appreciate. Pierre Dansereau, a well-known biologist and ecologist from Quebec, passed away in 2011, 1 month shy of his 100th birthday. He believed that it is necessary to have a happy frugality. The term is jarring. A happy frugality? This is a step beyond satisfaction. I don't think that he was advocating poverty. Rather, I think that he wanted us to live our lives in a manner that allows us to obtain an adequate living without doing irreparable harm to the environment. To do that individually and collectively is to have a reason to be happy. And it goes on to talk about Alan and Violet Large in Truro, And they were a couple who won $11 million in a lottery and ended up giving most of it away. And that indeed, I think, was happy frugality. It's really a pleasure to see so many of you this morning. When I was looking at the screen and gallery view, and I saw so many familiar faces, and it's just great to be back, even if virtually, and to be with you this morning. I'm going to be talking about the threshold of balancing the food system, and I want to start by talking about when I was a kid, at the times of my grandpa, and when I went to 4-H in the 60s, we were always told that the population was growing and growing and growing, and therefore we had to produce more food. At that point, the population was only 3.5 billion. Today, it's well over 7 billion, and the prediction is by FAO and by the UN that it might go to 9 to 10 billion. That's a 30 to 40% increase from today. And the thought is that in developing countries, average incomes are going to rise, people are going to consume more meat, richer foods, and therefore we need to increase food production by 70 to 100%, not just the 30 to 40. Or maybe what they're not really saying, these are colleagues of mine, it's not so much increasing food production as it is increasing feed production. And I think that when we really think about this, what we want to do is to balance production on one hand and consumption on the other. We want sufficient production to equal adequate, healthy consumption. And my Indigenous colleagues and friends have told me that consumption is not just food. Consumption is about food and medicine. And I had to learn this lesson when I asked an Indigenous friend to come to my class to teach one day, and I said she had 50 minutes, and she wanted to talk about food and medicine. And I said, no, you don't have enough time. I just want you to talk about food. She said, I don't care if I just have 5 minutes. If I talk about food, I'm going to talk about food and medicine. So I learned a lot even before that class started. Now, a plan B, going away from the original plan A of growing more and more food, is that we could have more and improved education for girls and women in developing countries, with a goal of coming in under 9 billion people by 2050. And indeed, there are new studies coming out now to say that probably we're going to peak at about 9.4 and then start dropping. One of the other things we can do is to reduce wasted food. It's now more than 40% in Canada, and I'll talk about this in a minute. And then, of course, we can eat less meat, and this could be meat of higher quality, and more pulses and edible insects. Now, going back to wasted food, we could feed 1 billion extra people if we applied the best current methods to reduce wasted food. That's just the current methods that we already have, not to mention all the things that we still could do. And in Canada today, the value of wasted food is $49.5 billion, and it would be 2.5 times that if we included all the associated costs of labor and energy and water and so on that went into producing that food. And I want to mention something about meat production. A few years ago in The Guardian, they reported that in 1982, the average Chinese person ate 13 kilograms of meat per year. And that has now gone up to 63 kilograms per year, and it's expected to rise to 93 kilograms per person per year if nothing changes. However, the Chinese government has said that they have a new goal of going back to 30 kilograms of meat per person per year to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 1 billion tons. So they want to bring it back from 60 to 30 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but more importantly, in the Chinese view, to lessen the country's problems with obesity and diabetes. Now, there are a few things that I've found interesting about what the pandemic is revealing. It's revealing the just-in-time long supply chains, and so far they're holding up, but they're under stress. And I think the lesson that we're seeing is that we need a little bit more redundancy. And of course, the biblical Joseph would have known about that. He had the advantage of seeing into the future. I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not aware of anyone who does. But he knew that famine was coming, and they prepared for it. And with our long supply chains, where we have a lot of people concentrated in meatpacking plants or in processing units, and when there can be disruptions to the supply chain, we're vulnerable, and we may need a little bit more redundancy and storage. It's really interesting to me to see how local farmers are surprisingly resilient. Example, Taproot Farm in Nova Scotia. My understanding is they've been doing very well with their community-supported agriculture box program. The farmers market in Halifax is adapting with online options, and as farmers markets are around the country. And then, of course, there's gardening. Inch by inch, we can grow our gardens, and that's about as local as it gets. And I've been hearing so many stories about people telling me that they hadn't bothered gardening before, but now that they're at home, they have a bit more time, they're doing it. The other thing that's becoming more and more evident is that we need local canning capacity. We have a lot of fruits and vegetables in Nova Scotia, Ontario, at the end of the summer season. That's when we really need canning capacity to keep some of those in the area. And abattoirs also, local abattoirs, need reinforcement. The other thing that we've known in agriculture for some time, but that's becoming more and more evident now, is we need affordable, effective, rural internet as a basic infrastructure. It's really important for farmers to connect to their customers and so on, and also to do some of the work that they do with the sensors on their farm that are GPS guided to have effective rural internet. And then there are the temporary foreign workers. Some of us in agriculture have known about this, but it's becoming more and more apparent that they really are essential in agriculture. And that's why I chose the song, These Hands. It's these hands of the temporary foreign workers that are really helping us to produce the food that we need to produce. I grant it that there can be improvements. Possibly they could have unions. I think they should have options to become permanent residents if they want to do that. Although the foreign workers that I've met, given that they're from the Caribbean and Mexico, don't really want to stay in Canada in the wintertime for some strange reason. Now, the other thing is when we look at consumption, the consumption has been of food that is cheap and convenient. And much of the food that we eat in Canada and North America is consumed in cars while we're driving, or it's often consumed while we're doing something else. And yet, 2/3 of healthcare costs can now be attributed to chronic diseases associated with unhealthy eating. There is a real high cost to unhealthy eating. And then I want to talk a little bit about advertisers and kids with drinking problems. A can of pop, just one can of pop, has close to the recommended daily maximum recommendations for sugar. Public Health Canada notes that 25% of children consume sugary drinks every day. Canadian children and youth spend 8 hours per day on screens, and maybe it's even more now during the pandemic, and they view more than 25 million food and beverage ads, and more than 90% of those ads are for unhealthy foods. I really think that we should have a policy that if those companies want to advertise that, then they should not be able to declare that a tax expense. They should do that on their own dime. And as the Heart and Stroke Foundation says, industry should pick on someone its own age. And then there's, of course, the relationship between food insecurity and poor health. The And this is according to Val Tarasuk at the University of Toronto, and she's done some really good work on this. The annual healthcare costs in food secure households are 23% lower than in a household with marginal food insecurity. If a household has moderate food insecurity, then the health costs in those homes with the moderate insecurity are 49% higher. And if there is severe food insecurity, then the annual healthcare costs are 121% higher than in a food secure household. And Val Tarasuk, as much as anyone in Canada, says that food insecurity is caused by poverty. It's not by a lack of food in Canada, it's by poverty. Now, and just going back to that, one of the ways to address poverty is with the universal basic income, and I will get to that in a few minutes. Now, across the world today, we have global fossil fuel subsidies that are $500 to $600 billion per year. Food production contributes more than 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but agriculture could stop adding CO2 to the air and pull it out of the air or sequester it. So we could cut those GHG emissions in half every decade. This is what Rockstrom Real recommended in 2017. There is a word now from the International Energy Agency that the pandemic will probably reduce CO2 emissions by 6 to 8% in 2020. But we're learning that we need at least a 7.6 decline every year. So as brutal as it appears to have been in how we've gone about reducing our greenhouse gas emissions this year, 2020, we're going to have to do it every year from now on to meet our Paris objectives and to get below 1.5 degrees of warming. We could pay farmers to sequester carbon dioxide. There are many opportunities for them to do this, and I'll tell you about this. I think this is another way that fields of gold can take on added meaning. So we could measure the outcome of soil organic carbon. And when plants take carbon dioxide out of the air, it goes into the plants and then the roots and into the soil and into soil organic carbon. We could measure this in every field every 5 years with a consistent scientific protocol. And then we could adjust farm property tax accordingly. So if a farmer's soil organic carbon is good or very good or going up, they would pay less property tax. And when I'm at a farm meeting, this is the part they don't like. If their soil organic carbon is fair, poor, or decreasing, they would pay more property tax. Now, perennial forages, think alfalfa, red clover, timothy, improve soil and they take carbon out of the air. And this soil organic carbon, as I've mentioned, is a measurable asset. And there was a really interesting study done recently by Paige Stanley and others in Michigan. And they showed that when you raise beef in a feedlot, the net emissions of CO2 per kilogram of meat are about 6. On the other hand, if you have a really well-managed grazing program with the grass there all the time, sequestering carbon, that you actually sequester more than 6 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of carcass weight. And that includes accounting for all the burping and the farting that the cows and the sheep are doing. Now, if you have this well-managed grazing, it takes about twice as much land as it would to raise all those cattle in a feedlot. But then we would also be sequestering a lot of carbon, which is a public service. And I think it would be up to us to just eat 50% of the beef we eat now rather than as much as we do. You remember the China example, they were worried about going from 63 to 93. We're well above 100 kilograms of meat per person per year. Now, animals should be eating feed, not food. And one of the best examples of this are forages, and forages do all these wonderful things in the soil. And perennial forage plants and their roots hold plants and soil close, if I may refer back to one line in Spirit of Life. I think there are other ways that animals can eat feed. We can think of byproducts from food processing and so on. Up until a few decades ago, animals only ate feed. They only ate cereals and things that were not suitable for people, and they did not eat food. We've been so focused now in getting gains per animal that we've actually started feeding feed that is so good it qualifies as food. I can assure you 100 years from now, we won't be doing that anymore. So going back to forages, forage-fed animals have meat and milk with higher CLAs, conjugated linolenic acids, and higher omega-3 levels and minimum or no antibiotics. That's all good. They exercise more and express natural behavior. I want to switch gears a little bit now and go to nitrogen fertilizer. About half the people today depend directly on the Haber-Bosch process for basic food. Fritz Haber in 1908 invented the process to make nitrogen fertilizer. And I won't go into the details of that, but it requires a lot of energy to get high enough heat and pressure to make this nitrogen fertilizer. His buddy Bosch figured out how to scale it up, and we've had nitrogen fertilizer manufacturing since the time of the First World War, and now up to half of us are depending on this. The problem with nitrogen fertilizer is that it is 1/3 of the global agricultural energy budget and all the associated greenhouse gas emissions that go with that. And when you look at agriculture, it's not so much the transportation, although that is part of the problem. Nitrogen fertilizer is the key ingredient when it comes to consuming energy and emitting greenhouse gas emissions. And then, of course, we get the excess losses of N to the water and to air. Now, the other thing that I think is really interesting is that in 40 years, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizer increased 5 to 7 times. That was only up to 2007. In that time, food production only increased 2 times. And I want to say something here about the value of dependable agricultural land. Classes 1, 2, and 3 are the best land. Class 1 is the best. And class 1, 2, and 3 are dependable. If we have droughts or floods, we've got a much better chance of continuing to grow food in that land. Classes 4, 5, and 6 are less dependable. So I would argue in Ontario, we have a green belt around Toronto. I would argue that we should have a green blob program. Wherever there is class 1, 2, or 3 land for growing food or wetlands, that should be preserved wherever it is. And I think the same should apply in Nova Scotia. We do not want to build parking lots and buildings on that land. Now, coming back to balancing production and consumption, I haven't yet referred to organic agriculture, and I talk about it in the book quite a bit. And I like to ask the question, what if mainstream agriculture had evolved differently and we produced high quality food with yields that are about 25% lower than now? And there are a number of papers, a Canadian paper a few years ago also showed that organic yields on average are about 25% lower. Some say 20%, but let's go with 25. So what if mainstream agriculture had evolved like that and we had all this high quality food and yields were lower? And what if wasted food was 15% instead of 40% as it is now? If we had those two conditions, would we aspire to produce 25% more food so that we could waste 40%? Now, I want to go back to the insights of the pandemic, and these show us that we have the option to cross the threshold of shifting to, one, a green economy and a retreat from fossil fuels. There's more and more information coming out about that. We can cross the threshold and shift to a universal basic income or a guaranteed livable income. This is what so many people are calling for as a way to make sure that we're more fair in society, and that it's one way of dealing with inequality. And by the way, I'm reading Lars Osberg's book right now about inequality. It's an excellent book. 3, we could cross the threshold and shift to a healthy food system, not so many sugar-sweetened beverages. 4, shift to paying farmers to sequester carbon. And I think there are lots of options for this. And if farmers were paid to do that, I'm sure they would do it. And then, of course, shift to balancing production and consumption, not emphasizing more and more production, but balancing production and consumption with less wasted food in the middle. And then, of course, it all goes, I think, in the end, to an attitude of gratitude for the land and the food that we have. And it's really important to appreciate when we have enough and then to treasure it. Thank you. Back to you, Norm.
Thank you, Ralph. I really appreciate your comments, and I've been taking notes. I'll resist responding immediately. We have a chance to do that after the service ends, when we're in our gallery view or breakout. But over to Jessica now, Jessica has selected a very appropriate piece of music for our interlude.
Hi, so I picked Big Yellow Taxi by Canadian singer-songwriter Joni Mitchell. This piece fits in what Ralph Martin was talking about very well. So I hope you enjoy it. They paid paradise and put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hot spot. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paid paradise and put up a parking lot. They took all the trees and put them in a tree museum, and they charged the people $1.50 just to see them. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paid paradise and put up a parking lot. Hey, farmer, farmer, put away that DDT now. Give me spots on my apples, but leave me the birds and the bees, please. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paid paradise and put up a parking lot. Late last night I heard the screen door slam, and a big yellow taxi took away my old man. Oh, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paid paradise and put up a parking lot. Oh, da-da-da, oh, da-da-da. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paid paradise and put up a parking lot. They paid paradise and put up a parking lot. One more time. They paid paradise and put up a parking lot.
Our offertory is a time of ritual, a time to celebrate the importance of generosity and leading a good life. And the congregation has responded again and again to this call. I have with me here our collection plate, which has gone around in this sanctuary many times. Now we get to do this virtually. This message from the board of this church. In this difficult time, our focus now is to pay staff salaries, to keep the food box stocked, to provide financial aid to people impacted by COVID-19 through the minister's discretionary fund, and to continue to provide a Saturday brunch in takeout form. If you'd like to assist with this, please email treasurer@uuch.ca for information on how to set up an automatic monthly withdrawal. A one-time e-transfer sent to treasurer@uuch.ca no longer needs a security question, but do indicate what it's for. Example, your pledge for the Saturday brunch, for the minister's discretionary fund, etc. And if you'd like to send us a check, just use the church address for that. Signed with gratitude, your treasurer. Closing words this morning are by our guest, Ralph Martin, from his book on food security. Ralph wrote, "We are not just members of a human community. We're connected to all and everything that we share our planet with. Animals, plants, even the non-living elements. We are linked among stars and atoms in a relational dance of reverence, in an awestruck reverie at the wonder of it all and our place in it." And now we come to the end of our service, and I invite Tristan Saunier to read the words that will accompany the extinguishing of our chalice.
I'm Tristan. As we extinguish the chalice, marking the end of our service, may we demonstrate our faith in life by doing wise planting so that our generations to come harvest more love, peace, and justice. May our fields of promise yield a sustainable harvest for our descendants. Back to you, Norm.
Thank you, Tristan. I extinguish the chalice here in our sanctuary on English Street until we gather again in a spiritual community. And now over to Mariah again for our closing hymn.
to you, Norm.
Thank you, Mariah. I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone tuning into the service today to say we're so appreciative to have you and your father with us today, and to think that a lot of your formative years were spent here in this congregation. Thank you again.